Okay, you guys, so here's a Hoodoo Heritage Month deep dive of Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, which is one of my favorite books of all time. So before we get into it, a central theme I need you to remember is the myth around the flying African. This picture is from a Milestone comic, but it depicts a flying African American. However, the myth of the flying Africans goes as this. There was a legend a long time ago that all God's children had wings, and the cruelties and evils of enslavement clipped their ability to fly. And when they were brought here and put on the plantations, some Africans still remembered the secret right of flight to return back home, allowing those who knew certain words to escape enslavement and fly back over the ocean to their homeland. This is a heavy mythology within the Gullah culture, which is a rich culture in itself, and just African American folklore and Afro-Caribbean folklore. And personally, as I believe, all myths come from some strain of truth. And as you see those slave narratives back in the day where they were interviewed, everybody always either heard of it or they knew somebody who seen one. And some people even said, to expand on the legend, that black people would shapeshift into birds, which sounds in today's context like extraordinary and like, okay, that's definitely a myth. But if you look at this myth from a spiritual perspective, there are many people who were enslaved who had the power of foresight and could see spirit. So how do we know if when somebody would die on the plantation because of the cruel environment, those people who could see into the invisible world, spirit, what if it was just those people who had that type of foresight able to see their spirit fly into the divine? Call me woo-woo, but I believe in shit like that. So now let's get into the book. So I'm gonna have to use the inverted filter, but as you see, our main character right here is Milkman Dead III. His true name is Macon Dead, just like his father, Macon Dead Jr., and Macon Dead Jr. is named after Macon Dead I. Names in this book are a big thing, and a lot of them have the biblical lore, along with the title of the book being the Song of Solomon itself. So if you see, we have Solomon, we have Magdalena, who is a sister, 1 Corinthians dead, which is a sister, his mother, Ruth Foster, dead, and his father, Macon. Then he has his favorite auntie, Pilate, dead, her daughter, Reba, and then Reba's daughter, so Pilate's granddaughter, Hagar. And Hagar and Milkman, they have a romantic relationship, even though they're cousins. That was a lot, I know. But everybody I mentioned in that just part are all part of the Dead family. Now, if you're wondering, well, how the fuck did they get the last name Dead? Our boy here, Macon Dead the first Macon, his name was actually Jake, and he was a first generation off the plantation. Our boy, Macon the First, aka Jake, is the son of Solomon, and Solomon was a flying African who abandoned all of his responsibility and 21 children to fly back to Africa. Solomon's our main character's great-grandfather. So once again, bitch, how did they get the last name Dead? Well, before Jake was made into Macon, he went to the Freedmen's Bureau when he was freed from enslavement, and the guy who was writing down their name, I guess for the census, drunk man at the Freedmen's Bureau, is asking Jake, aka Macon, where are you from and where's your father? Or who is your father, to get his information for the census. Jake answers, he's like, my father, dead, where I'm from, Macon. So the drunk ass man's put where he's from, instead of putting Macon, Georgia, he puts Macon in his name slot, and then he puts Dead as his last name, Macon Dead. So therefore, the Macon Dead family has arrived. Macon Dead has two children, Macon Dead Jr. and Pilate. Pilate is born unusual because she's born without a belly button. Her mom died giving birth to her, and Pilate is like a cunning spiritual hoodoo woman. There are certain parts I will not give away because if you guys do choose to read this, I want you to be surprised. So let's continue. Side note, all that stuff I just said, y'all won't find out till like the middle of the book, but I just thought it was important for knowledge. The beginning of the book starts off with the town insurance agent, Robert, offing himself. And this book takes place in the Midwest in Michigan. The community insurance agent, Robert Smith, is on the top of the hospital called Mercy, which doesn't allow black people in at that time because this is the 30s. So a lot of the black people call it No Mercy because how you gonna help people but only help a certain demographic? Girl, on top of the hospital, Robert Smith, the town's insurance agent, who's very to himself, secluded, he does his job, goes home, and calls it a day. Very mysterious. Girl, the town's insurance agent, Robert Smith, has on some blue silk wings. He's at the top of Mercy Hospital, and he's about to fly. Very Icarus. And he draws a crowd because people are like, oh, this nigga about to take his own life. So all the black people in the community are gathered around to watch. Among the people gathered around to watch Robert, the insurance agent, take his flight into the great beyond is Ruth Foster dead, who is currently pregnant with our main character, Milkman dead. And the insurance man believes he can fly. He wants to be lifted from the bondage of life. And Ruth is standing there with her two daughters, 1 Corinthian and Magdalena, who we call Lena. So long story short, while everybody's watching, Robert tries to make his flight across the lake off the top of the hospital, and of course, he died. Like Icarus, he falls from the sky. And Ruth goes into labor, and Ruth ends up giving birth inside Mercy Hospital, making our main character, Milkman, the first black man ever to be birthed in Mercy Hospital. Because let me tell you something, Milkman's parents, Ruth and Macon, they're very rich, they're very blue blood for that time and era. Ruth is the daughter of the only black doctor in town, which makes her exclusive. And Macon, he's like an Ebenezer Scrooge. He has a lot of property and he's rude to people. But as quiet as it's kept, Milkman's father, Macon, is a gigolo because he got the money from Ruth's inheritance, from her doctor dad. So he's like estranged from his family and community because all he believes in money, power, and respect. He's the prime example of not all skin folk are kinfolk. And he don't got no time for no lower class blacks, so he's that type. Which is why he's also estranged from his sister Pilot, because she is a completely like of the earth, free woman, uninhibited by society standards of who she should be as a black woman. Whereas her brother Macon, even though he's a successful businessman, at what price did he have to sacrifice by fitting into society standard? He falls into the stereotype of what does it profit a man to gain the world and still loses his soul at the same time. Macon Jr. don't want nothing also to do with his sister Pilot because he feels like they betrayed each other in their youth. Because what we learn is these two, Macon Jr. and Pilot, they grew up on a place called Lincoln's Heaven, which was their father's farm. He was a black man who owned land, which was rare back then. And unfortunately, Macon Jr. and Pilot see their father be murdered by white men because they want his land, leaving these two orphaned. And since the father was killed for the land, the two kids have to escape because they'll be killed too because they have a claim to it. And these two end up taking vastly different paths in life after a big event happens after their father was killed. Macon, however, meets Ruth, who is the doctor's daughter, and when the doctor dies, he inherits Ruth's money because he's the man back then, and he uses Ruth's inherited money to make him wealthy beyond measure, making them middle-class black people for the era. But these two, Macon Jr. and Pilot, siblings, they never see eye to eye again. So Macon is like, he tells all his kids, 1 Corinthian, Lena, and Milkman, to have nothing to do with his sister because she's a charlatan, when she's nothing of the sort. After Milkman is born, one of Ruth's friends come over and asks her, was he born with a caul? Ruth's friends tells her she should have made a T out of his caul so he wouldn't end up seeing ghosts. Which foreshadows for us, Milkman is clairvoyant. So Milkman, he grows up privileged, entitled, and never accountable, and he meets Guitar Bangs. Now, Guitar he comes from the struggle. Guitar's mother, Mrs. Bang, rents an apartment from Macon Jr., so Milkman's dad. And even when she's late, he's like, that's not my problem, we all got bills. And Guitar is older than Milkman, so Milkman looks at him as the older brother he never had, because all he has is older sisters, who pretty much always clean up behind Milkman. Since Milkman is young, he wants to do everything Guitar does because that's like his big brother. So long story short, Guitar introduces him to Pilot. And Pilot already knows who Milkman is. Milkman has just never met her because he's forbidden to meet his father's sister. And I know some of y'all are probably like, Milkman, that's such an odd name. Why is he named that? Well, let me tell you. Milkman's real name is Macon Dead III because he's named after his father, Macon Jr., and he's named after his father, Macon the First. However, what we find out is that Milkman's mother, Ruth, she was breastfeeding him way longer than what she should have been. He was asking for lunch money and she pulling out a titty. I'm lying, but you get the drift. A neighbor sees her breastfeeding him and he's like, oh, you got you a Milkman. And you know how nicknames grow in black community. Comment for part 2 because it only gets messier. The Hoodoo and Song of Solomon part 2. So as we fast forward through the first half of the book, our main character here, Milkman, he grows into a man who's able to stretch his boyhood out. He's entitled, he's privileged, his parents got money, people do stuff for him, he's materialistic, he's arrogant, and he's kind of misogynistic. And the most important thing to remember about Milkman Dead is he's spiritually dead, which is like a metaphor for his last name too. Milkman is the true definition of he's just looking for a good time. He goes wherever the wind blows. He's lost in life. And he's about to be 31. I mean, you have Milkman who's best friends with Guitar Bangs, but Guitar always be checking him. And Guitar has his own life going on too. Guitar's a little bit older, so he sees Milkman's immaturity, and Milkman always tends to feel judged by Guitar because Guitar calls him out on his bullshit. Milkman is also sleeping with his cousin Haggard, who is Pilot, his auntie's granddaughter. Yes, it's just as crazy as it sounds. Haggard is older than Milkman, and they get so infatuated with each other. Well, Haggard gets so infatuated with him, when he be like blowing her off, she tries to kill him every time she sees him, like with a butcher knife type shit. Like she wants to take his head off, decapitate him. And as they say, Haggard got one of those graveyard type loves. And like I say, serves you right for fucking within your bloodline. Girl, Macon Jr., Milkman's dad, wants him to take up the family business, but that's not really Milkman's calling. Honestly, nothing's Milkman's calling because he's lost. He finds himself at a cultural crossroad. And he thinks he's nothing like his father, but of course he's more like his father than he likes to admit. And he's in a crossroad because he's not really accepted by his community, black people. And he's too egotistical to see why there's a disconnect. And Milkman embodies a lot of his father's chauvinistic traits. And like I said, I'm leaving a lot of stuff out so you guys have some shit to discover if you choose to read this one day too. And as Milkman grows older and he becomes more discontent with his life, he starts to hear rumors about his best friend Guitar having some dirty dealing. So him and Guitar sit down, and he's like, Guitar, man, what's going on? And Guitar's looking at him like, what's going on with you? Not much, clearly. But Milkman is like, Guitar, you know everything about me. You could tell me what's going on. Because Guitar's been AWOL, and they're like besties. And Guitar and him are having like a heart-to-heart. And Guitar's like, well, I have a dark secret, and you can't tell nobody else, or that's your life. And Milkman's like, yeah, you could trust me. You know all about my shortcomings. What's up? And Guitar reveals to him that he is in a group called The 7 Days, which I love the 7 Days. The concept of them, not what they do. The 7 Days is an all-black, dark vigilante group filled of 7 people for 7 days of the week, Monday through Sunday. Guitar is the Sunday man. What they do is, whenever there's a racial crime or injustice, they mimic the same crime onto the same race that employed it onto black people. So within this book, the book touches upon the murder of Emmett Till because it's around that era when all this happened. So the 7 days job is, depending on what day the murder happens, that man, so say if it's the Monday man, the Sunday man, the Tuesday man, you get whatever day the murder happens, that person who's assigned that day of the week has to commit the same crime on that race. So like everything that happened to Emmett Till, they gotta find a boy of the race that committed the crime and do the same to him. Milkman is kind of like, this is intense. And morally, Milkman somewhat understands, but he's against it because he was like, to get down as low as them, like, I get it, but it's wrong. Like Guitar tells him, well, the black people who are thrust into these racist situations don't do anything. They could be walking down the road and next thing you know, they're attacked. They really believe in the eye for the eye type justice. So Milkman is like, well, who are the other 7 members? And he's like, Guitar, which day are you? And Guitar's like, I'm the Sunday man. And some of the other men are just black men they know around town from like the barber shop and the bars and shit like that. There's a member named Nero, Empire State, Hospital Tommy, Guitar Baines, Milkman's best friend, obviously, and then Henry Porter. And we're gonna get back to Henry Porter. The insurance man from earlier was in it too. But I've always felt like it's the guilt that made him want to fly away, which is why he took himself out. But this is kind of answered why Guitar has somewhat changed and been a little bit more AWOL for Milkman. And Milkman's like, I wonder how long he's been in 7 days and what other crimes has he committed within this dark vigilante. And then there's this scene where Guitar and Milkman are talking and they see a peacock and he wonders why he can't get up off the ground. And it's because his tail is too heavy, and Guitar tells him it's all that vanity, it's weighing him down. If you want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down. Which makes him look inward to see what's truly weighing him down. And then of course Milkman becomes closer with his Aunt Pilot because it's kind of like, you know when a parent tells you not to, now you're intrigued to learn why. Then we also get into the origin of how Milkman came to be, which is thanks to Pilot's mojos. Through their first 2 daughters, First Corinthians and Magdalena, unlike Pilot, who was just very, I am who I am, I'm in your face, I'll go up against a man or a woman, Milkman's mother, Ruth, she is a lot more subdued, quiet, upper class. Ruth doesn't have the strongest backbone. You know, up until the age of 16, she was cared by her father. She's a daddy's girl. And pretty much worrying that her loveless marriage was going to end, Ruth goes to Macon's sister, Pilot, and they get a love charm. Well, Pilot makes a love charm because, you know, she's a skilled root worker. They feed it to Macon. Macon and her make love after, I think, almost a couple months or a year of not sleeping together. So Ruth gets pregnant with Milkman, but Macon Jr., he doesn't want that. So he's feeding her castor oil, because, back in the day, that'll make you have an abortion. And he hits her and he abuses her because he wants her to miscarry. However, Ruth escapes back to Pilate, and she's like, your brother is beating me and trying to take our baby. And Pilate's like, oh, I got something for his bitch ass. And you know what she does? She makes a puppet. In other words, like a voodoo doll type thing, and sets it in Macon's office. Now, since they grew up together, Pilate and Macon Jr., he already knows what she can do because they from the South. And even though Macon's a sellout culturally, he knows not to touch some root work that is meant to do him harm. So he kicks it off and he tries to burn it. However, it doesn't burn because it's enchanted. So what happens is he has to burn it up in flames for 9 days until it finally succumbs and turns to ash. And after that, he never messes with Ruth during the pregnancy again, which also shows you that Milkman wasn't wanted even before his birth. The only one that wanted him was his mother and his aunt, who helped bring him about. But Milkman is so egotistical and so caught up in his own world, he doesn't realize how the women around him is what have kept him alive, not the men. And the problem is, in this context, women are always thought of as second, composed to a man who will take your life. And which is why there's a quote in the book where it says, I guess it'll come down to it, would you save my life or would you take my life? So some events transpire and Milkman has to go back to his father's hometown. But before he goes to his father's hometown, we discover his sister, 1 Corinthians. I love that name. 1 Corinthians is the example of a woman who does everything right and it still comes up short. College educated in France, 1 Corinthians is so decorated. However, as a black woman, when she returns home, the only job she can get is a maid. And at this point, if Milkman is 31, 1 Corinthians are in their late 30s, early 40s. But in that era, the 30s and the 40s, they're like old maiden. Like they should have been married off. But they're not, and they're just taken care of by their father. So when 1 Corinthians sees that all her accolades didn't get her nothing, and the only job she can get is as a maid, it's like such a kick in the face. But then, while she's on the bus coming home, she meets a man named Henry Porter. They have a steamy-like affair, but she doesn't want to bring him home to her parents because she knows they'll never approve because he's lower in class than her. But she really does like him. But Milkman ruins all that stuff when he sees them one day. And what Milkman soon discovers about her steamy affair with this guy named Henry Porter, he's a part of the 7 days. So he ruins it for 1 Corinthians, who that could have been her true love, and tells their father, and the father forbids her from ever seeing him again. Which results in Magdalena coming to snap on Milkman and tell him he needs to find himself because you're so used to everybody taking care of you, especially the women, that you think you could ruin everybody's life because you pretty much tell them you don't give a fuck about nobody but yourself. So Milkman leaves town and he goes to discover his ancestry, because you can't know where you're going until you know where you come from. And he goes to this town called Shalimar, and everybody in the town is named Solomon. They're all named in the remembrance of his great-grandfather. And what he discovers is his grandfather was a flying African. There's a lot I'm leaving out. And discovering his ancestry awakens his spirit. And we find out that Solomon had 21 children, the last one Jake, and left them all. Solomon tries to take Jake with him, but he drops him. There's a whole song about it. And Milkman finds out his grandfather jumped off a cliff to fly, which is why the cliff is called Solomon's Leap. And Milkman discovers that this nursery rhyme that these kids say in his family's hometown are about his ancestors. They say Solomon and Rina, Bahali Shalut, Yoruba Medina, Muhammad II, Nestor Kalina, Sarake Cake, 21 children, the last one Jake. And we all know Jake is actually Macon the First's real name. Part 3 will be the end. The final parts of Toni Morrison's magical odyssey, Song of Solomon. Milkman's immaturity is linked all the way back to his great-grandfather because it's that ancestral memory. His grandfather, Solomon, had 21 kids and he left them all behind just to fly back to Africa. Now, you can use the flight as many things. Did he die? Yes. Could he have took his own life by jumping off the cliff? Yes. Flight and magical realism tales can be many metaphors of whatever you want them to be for your interpretation. But Solomon left his 21 responsibilities, so henceforth he created a generational curse of abandonment. Then, unknowingly, the generational curse continued through Macon, aka Jake, when he got killed and he left his 2 kids to be left on their own. Death at times can feel like an abandonment. For a full circle moment, Macon Jr. and Pilot have a disagreement of a betrayal that you'll read if you take on the book. And the two siblings who only had each other separate, and they're never as close as they once were. So then you have somebody like Milkman, who was brought about through conjuring. He was birthed out of the fractured love of Macon Dad Jr. and Ruth foster dad. So it's not surprising that Milkman is entitled, he's selfish, and he's easy to just give up and abandon his responsibility. Everybody has these expectations of him, but he's always willing to give them up. Sort of like how his great-grandfather Solomon gave up his responsibility. And also a little side note that I left out. Back after Macon the First was killed and his two kids, Macon Jr. and Pilot, had to escape his farm because the white people were going to come after and kill them. They were assisted to the escape by a lady named Cersei who worked at the local other rich white people down south. What they didn't know is, though, the white people that Cersei worked for, she was like a maid, a servant, those were the people who killed Macon Dad Jr. and Pilot's father, Macon the First. So Cersei hid these kids in the house of their father's killer. But side note, Cersei was a good woman, and she got those kids eventually to safety. And before Pilot and Macon Dad Jr. Separated, they were already seeing their father's spirit, showing that the gift of foresight and clairvoyance was already in the bloodline. So then, like, I would say, 50 to 70 years later, when Milkman comes down south to learn his family's ancestry, he goes by Cersei's house. And you're probably like, Cersei? Shouldn't she be dead if she was helping out his father and auntie when they was kids and they already in their 70s by now? Absolutely. But remember, we know that Cersei is a ghost and Milkman can see the dead because of the call he had in the beginning in part 1 I told y'all about. So Cersei fills him in, and she takes on the role of like Cersei from the Odyssey of Greek mythology. She stays and she haunts her old masters. How? Because her remains were never buried. So long story short, by the time Milkman goes home, he is refreshed. He knows his family lineage. He knows what the true Song of Solomon, and he wants to share it with a Pilot and his family. However, some shit then went tragic, and while he was gone on his self-discovery journey, Haggard took herself out. Like, she was so in love with her cousin, it drove her mad. And once again, not too many spoilers, but now at this point, Milkman and Guitar, they're mortal enemies because something big happens in the book, and Guitar is trying to take Milkman's life. So we go from brothers to enemies. It's very, Tupac and Juice. Milkman's trying to duck and dodge Guitar, and he goes to tell Pilot the origin of their family and their lineage and what really happened and how all this stuff got started through Solomon. Pilot throws Milkman in her cellar because she's mad. Because Milkman and Haggard were both reckless with their love. And if you think about it, Haggard's story is very similar to Solomon because think of it, even though they're cousins, take that out of it. I know it's hard. Haggard loved Milkman so hard, she was willing to kill him so nobody else could have him, right? But in the end, Milkman left town to discover his own self-discovery. Solomon abandoned his wife and kids, 21 of them, just to go for a flight and free himself from the earthly bondage and leave the wife home to do the hardship. The cycles of abandonment never end. They just appear in new ways. After Solomon flies away, he has a wife named Rhina left behind with 21 children. She goes mad and she cries for the rest of her day. And when Milkman was down south in the woods, because there's another scene that I'm not going to tell y'all because I want y'all to be surprised. Milkman, while he's in the woods hunting, he hears a woman wailing, and he doesn't know that's his ancestral great-grandmother, Solomon's wife. Her cries are forever haunting the woods around the area where Solomon took his leap. Because ancestral memory and feeling can be a curse and a gift. We conclude with a theme of ancestral veneration. Milkman takes Pilot back down south and shows her Solomon's Leap, the cliff which their great-grandfather jumped off. Well, it would be Milkman's great-grandfather and just Pilot's grandfather. And they're going to pay their respects. Girl, and Guitar shows up. Because now Guitar and Milkman, they are not on speaking terms because Milkman did a betrayal in Guitar's perception. Guitar tells him, your day has come. And on Solomon's Leap, they fight to the death. Milkman realizes his father's money, all the women who protected him throughout his life, after a lifetime of privilege, only he can protect himself truly. Milkman stopped waving his narrowed eyes. He could just make out Guitar's head and shoulders in the dark. "You want my life?" Milkman was now shouting. "You need it? Here." Without wiping away his tears, taking a deep breath, or even bending his knees, he leaped. As fleet and bright as a lodestar, he wheeled towards Guitar, and it did not matter which one of them would give up their ghost in the killing arms of his brother. For now he knew what Shalimar knew. If you surrender to the air, you could ride it. So the book leaves you wondering, when they went off that cliff, do you believe that Milkman learned enough ancestral knowledge to fly? But when she says to surrender to the wind, you can ride it, is to let all earthly things binding you down go. And what we realize is, Milkman, since he now knows where his family came from, him standing up to Guitar is him paving his own path. It's like a grand rebirth he had, learning his ancestral history. Because like I always say, if you don't know where you come from, you're doomed to repeat it. Which is why earlier in the book, when she says, if you want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down, all of you guys got to ask yourself, what is the shit that's personally weighing you down? Solomon, in a complicated way, when he took his leap and he flew, he liberated himself from the bondage of what white man was placing on. But with certain types of liberation, there are prices sometimes. And by Milkman standing up to Guitar, what we learn is flying isn't always physical like his ancestor Solomon did. Flying is walking through old obstacles that would have destroyed you. And I mean, even in his last moments, he even says to himself, he never realized that his Aunt Pilot, who had so much less money than him, and his father, she was always more happy, she was always more fulfilled because Pilot knew how to fly without even having to leave the ground. And once you have a type of self-fulfillment, your happiness is no longer in the hands of somebody who could take it away. And honestly, as quiet as it's kept, this is a book, not physically, but that will teach you how to fly spiritually, mentally, and emotionally while you're still on Earth. Because it's just telling you to let go of that shit that's weighing you down. Let the people go, the generational curses, and the environment go. And side note, I didn't spoil a lot of it for you, so when y'all read this, y'all gonna see a lot of shit I left out, and you're gonna be like, he didn't even mention it.